The station was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. The platform was empty, save for a single bench and a flickering overhead light that buzzed like a dying insect. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and rusted metal, and the only sound was the distant echo of his own footsteps as he approached the edge of the platform. He hadn't planned to be here. In fact, he couldn't even remember how he had arrived. One moment, he was walking home from work, the next, he was standing in this desolate station, staring at the tracks that stretched into the darkness. The train had arrived without warning, its sleek black exterior gleaming under the dim light. There were no markings, no numbers, just a single door that slid open with a hiss, inviting him inside. He hesitated, glancing around the empty platform. There was no one else in sight, no conductor, no other passengers. The train seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration as if it were alive. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The interior was unlike any train he had ever seen. The walls were a deep, polished mahogany and the seats were upholstered in rich, crimson velvet. The air was warm, almost too warm, and carried with it the faint scent of something sweet and floral. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that danced across the floor as the train began to move. He took a seat near the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The train picked up speed, the darkness outside blurring into a seamless void. He tried to focus on his reflection in the glass, but it was distorted as if the window were made of some strange, rippling liquid. As the train hurtled through the tunnel, he noticed something odd. The other passengers were silent, their faces blank and expressionless. They sat perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes fixed on some distant point. He tried to catch someone's eye, to ask where they were going, but no one responded. It was as if they were in a trance. He stood up, his unease growing with each passing second. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The train seemed to go on forever, the rows of seats stretching out into infinity. He reached the end of the car and pushed open the door to the next one, only to find the same scene repeated over and over again. Panic began to set in. He turned back, but the door he had just come through was gone. The train was a labyrinth, a never-ending maze of identical cars. He ran, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, but no matter how far he went, he couldn't find an exit. Finally, he collapsed into a seat, his mind racing. What was this place? Where was the conductor? And why couldn't he remember how he had gotten here? As he sat there, trying to make sense of it all, he noticed something strange. The other passengers were beginning to change. Their faces were no longer blank, but twisted into expressions of fear and despair. Some of them were crying, others were whispering to themselves, their voices barely audible over the sound of the train. He felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary train. Something was very, very wrong. The train continued its relentless journey through the endless tunnels, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks becoming a monotonous backdrop to the growing unease in the car. The man, whose name he suddenly realized he couldn't recall, sat frozen in his seat, his eyes darting between the other passengers. Their faces were now contorted with emotions. Fear, sorrow, anger. But still, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional sob or the faint creak of the train as it swayed on its invisible tracks. He stood up again, determined to find answers. This time, he moved more slowly, observing the passengers more closely. As he passed by an elderly woman, he noticed something peculiar. Her hands were trembling, and her lips were moving, but no sound came out. He leaned in closer, trying to hear what she was saying, but the words were unintelligible, a jumble of whispers that seemed to slip away before he could grasp them. Further down the car, a young man was clutching a photograph, his eyes filled with tears. The man hesitated, then sat down across from him. "Hey," he said softly, "are you okay? Do you know where we are?" The young man didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on the photograph. But then, slowly, he looked up, his eyes hollow and distant. I don't know," he whispered. "I just want to go home." The man felt a pang of sympathy, but before he could say anything more, the young man's face twisted in pain, and he let out a scream that echoed through the car. The other passengers didn't react, as if they hadn't heard it at all. The man recoiled, his heart racing. as the young man's scream faded into silence, and he slumped back into his seat, his face once again blank. Shaken, the man stood and continued down the aisle. He needed to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. As he reached the end of the car, he noticed a door he hadn't seen before. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out from the crack. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, with walls lined with shelves filled with strange, glowing orbs. In the center of the room stood a figure, his back turned. The man cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice trembling. "Can you tell me where we are?" The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was both familiar and alien. His eyes were deep, dark pools, and his skin had an almost translucent quality. He smiled, but it was a cold, empty smile that sent a shiver down the man's spine. "You're on the train," the figure said, his voice echoing as if it were coming from far away. "The train that never stops." "But where are we going?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted his head, studying him with an intensity that made the man feel as though he were being stripped bare. "Nowhere," he replied. "Everywhere. This train is a journey, but not the kind you're used to. It's a journey of the soul." The man's heart sank. "What do you mean? Am I dead?" The figure's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Not dead," he said, "but not alive either. You're in between. This train is a place for those who are lost, for those who cannot move on. You are here because you have unfinished business, something that ties you to the world of the living." The man's mind raced. Unfinished business? What could it be? He tried to think, but his memories were foggy, as if they were just out of reach. "How do I leave?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The figure's expression darkened. "Leaving is not easy," he said. "The train does not stop. It does not let go. But if you are determined, if you can face what binds you here, you may find a way. But be warned, many have tried and few have succeeded." Before the man could ask more questions, the figure turned away, his form dissolving into the shadows. The room began to fade, the glowing orbs dimming until they were extinguished. The man stumbled back, finding himself once again in the endless car of the train. He stood there, his mind reeling. He was trapped, but not without hope. If he could uncover what was keeping him here, maybe he could find a way out. But first, he needed to remember. He needed to piece together the fragments of his past to understand why he was on this train. As he walked back to his seat, he noticed something else. The passengers were no longer silent. They were murmuring, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of whispers. He strained to hear what they were saying, but the words were indistinct, a chorus of regrets, fears, and unspoken truths. He sat down, closing his eyes and focusing on his breathing. He needed to stay calm, to think clearly. But as the train continued its endless journey, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The whispers of the passengers grew louder, filling the car with an eerie symphony of fragmented voices. The man clenched his fists, trying to block out the noise, but it seeped into his mind, tugging at the edges of his consciousness. He felt a headache coming on, a sharp pain behind his eyes that made it difficult to focus. But amidst the chaos, something began to stir within him. A memory, faint and elusive, like a dream upon waking. He closed his eyes, letting the train's rhythmic motion lull him into a semi-trance. Images flickered in his mind, disjointed and fleeting. A woman's face, her eyes filled with tears. A child's laughter, echoing in a sunlit room. A dark road, rain pelting down as headlights blurred in the distance. He couldn't make sense of it all, but he knew these fragments were pieces of his life, pieces he had lost. The man opened his eyes, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He needed to remember more. He needed to know why he was here. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and began to walk through the car again, this time with a purpose. He approached a middle-aged man sitting near the window, his face etched with lines of sorrow. "What's your name?" the man asked, his voice trembling. The middle-aged man looked up, his eyes hollow. I don't remember," he said, his voice barely audible. "I just know I don't belong here." The man nodded, feeling a pang of empathy. "Do you remember anything? Anything at all?" The middle-aged man hesitated, then whispered, "I remember a hospital, machines beeping. My wife, she was crying. I think I was dying." The man's heart sank. He moved on, stopping next to a young woman who was clutching a locket. "What about you?" he asked gently. "Do you know why you're here?" The young woman looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I was running," she said. "Running from something or someone. I don't remember, but I couldn't stop. And then, I was here." The man felt a chill run down his spine. Each passenger seemed to carry a fragment of their past, a piece of their unfinished story. He wondered if he was the same, if his own memories were buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. As he continued to walk, he noticed something strange. The train was changing. The walls seemed to ripple, the colors shifting and blending like oil on water. The air grew colder, and the whispers of the passengers began to fade, replaced by a low, ominous hum. He felt a pull, as if the train itself were guiding him toward something. He followed the pull, moving through car after car until he reached a door that hadn't been there before. It was old and weathered, with intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story. He hesitated, then pushed the door open. Inside was a room unlike any he had seen on the train. It was small and dimly lit, with a single chair in the center. On the walls were mirrors, but instead of reflecting the room, they showed scenes from his life. He stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. In one mirror, he saw himself as a child, playing in a park with a woman who must have been his mother. In another, he was older, standing at a graveside, his face streaked with tears. The images shifted, showing moments of joy, pain, love, and loss. He felt a lump in his throat as the memories flooded back, each one more vivid than the last. But there was one memory that stood out, one that made his blood run cold. He saw himself driving on a dark, rainy night. The road was slick and he was going too fast. He saw the headlights of another car, heard the screech of tires, and then nothing. The memory ended abruptly, leaving him standing in the room, his hands trembling. He knew now why he was here. He had been in an accident. He had died, or at least he had come close to dying. And now he was trapped on this train, a place for souls who couldn't move on. But why? What was keeping him here? He thought back to the figure in the room of glowing orbs. "You have unfinished business," the figure had said. But what was it? What had he left undone? As he stood there, lost in thought, the mirrors began to darken, the images fading into blackness. The room grew colder, and he felt a presence behind him. He turned, but there was no one there, only the faint sound of laughter echoing in the distance. He knew he couldn't stay here. He had to keep moving to find a way out. But as he left the room and returned to the endless cars of the train, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Something, or someone, was following him, waiting for the right moment to strike. The train's atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with an oppressive energy that made it difficult to breathe. The man moved cautiously through the cars, his senses on high alert. The passengers were no longer murmuring. They were silent once more, their faces blank and lifeless. But he could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting. It was as if the train itself had become a living entity, aware of his presence and intent on keeping him trapped. He reached the end of the car and pushed open the door to the next one, only to find it identical to the last. The endless repetition was maddening, but he pressed on, determined to find something, anything, that could help him escape. As he walked, he noticed that the shadows seemed to be growing darker, more defined. They stretched across the floor and walls, twisting and writhing like living things. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the wall, taking on a humanoid form. It moved toward him, its featureless face somehow conveying malice. The man stumbled back, his heart pounding, as the shadow reached out with long, claw-like fingers. He turned and ran, but the shadow followed, its movement swift and unnatural. He burst into the next car, slamming the door behind him. The shadow didn't follow, but he could feel its presence on the other side of the door, waiting. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. What were these shadows? Were they manifestations of the passengers' fears, or something more sinister? As he stood there, he noticed something strange. The car he was in now was different from the others. The seats were empty and the walls were covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. He approached one of the symbols, reaching out to touch it. As his fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, and he was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. Fear, anger, sorrow, regret. He pulled his hand away, shaking. The symbols seemed to be tied to the passengers' emotions, their unfinished business. He wondered if they held the key to escaping the train. If he could decipher them, maybe he could find a way out. He began to study the symbols more closely, trying to make sense of their patterns. Some were simple, others complex, but they all seemed to tell a story. He saw images of people, places, and events, each one connected to a specific emotion. He realized that the symbols were a map, a guide to the passengers' pasts and the things that bound them to the train. As he studied the symbols, he felt a presence behind him. He turned, but there was no one there. The shadows had returned, creeping along the walls and floor, closing in on him. He knew he didn't have much time. He needed to find the symbol that represented his own unfinished business. He scanned the walls, his eyes darting from one symbol to the next. Finally, he saw it. A symbol that seemed to call to him, pulsing with a faint golden light. He reached out and touched it, and once again, he was overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. But this time, he saw a clear image in his mind. He was standing in a hospital room, looking down at a figure lying in a bed. It was him, but it wasn't. The man in the bed was pale and lifeless, connected to machines that beeped steadily. A woman sat beside the bed, her face streaked with tears. She was holding his hand, whispering words he couldn't hear. The memory shifted, and he saw himself standing outside the hospital, looking up at the window of the room. He felt a deep sense of regret, a longing to go back, to tell the woman something important. But he couldn't. He was trapped, unable to move on. The image faded, and he was back in the train car, the shadows closing in around him. He knew now what his unfinished business was. He needed to say goodbye, to let go of the life he had left behind. But how could he do that from here? The shadows were almost upon him now, their cold, dark tendrils reaching out to envelop him. He closed his eyes, focusing on the memory of the woman in the hospital room. He thought of her face, her voice, the love they had shared. He whispered her name, though he couldn't remember it, and felt a surge of warmth in his chest. The shadows recoiled, as if repelled by the light within him. He opened his eyes and saw that the symbols on the walls were glowing brighter, their light pushing back the darkness. He knew what he had to do. He needed to confront his past, to face the regrets that bound him to the train. But as he turned to leave the car, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing in the doorway was the figure from the room of glowing orbs. His dark eyes fixed on the man with an intensity that made him feel as though he were being stripped bare. "You're getting closer," the figure said, his voice echoing in the silence. "But the hardest part is yet to come. Are you ready to face what lies ahead?" The man swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he had no choice. He nodded, and the figure stepped aside, allowing him to pass. As he walked into the next car, he felt a sense of determination he hadn't felt before. He was going to find a way out of this train, no matter what it took. But he also knew that the shadows were still out there, waiting for him to falter. The next car was unlike any he had seen before. The walls were no longer polished mahogany but rusted metal, corroded and dripping with moisture. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay. The seats were gone, replaced by jagged, uneven surfaces that seemed to grow out of the floor like twisted roots. The dim light flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. The man hesitated at the threshold, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But he knew he couldn't. The figure's words echoed in his mind. The hardest part is yet to come. He stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach churn. As he moved deeper into the car, he noticed something strange. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. The rusted metal groaned and shifted, and he realized with a growing sense of dread that the car was changing, reshaping itself around him. The floor tilted, and he stumbled, catching himself on a jagged outcropping that cut into his palm. He hissed in pain, pulling his hand away to see blood welling up from the wound. Before he could react, the car shuddered violently, and the walls began to close in. He broke into a run, his heart pounding as he dodged the jagged protrusions that seemed to reach out for him. The car was narrowing, the ceiling descending, and he knew he had to reach the other end before he was crushed. He sprinted, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as the walls closed in around him. Just as he thought he wouldn't make it, he burst through the door at the far end, collapsing onto the floor of the next car. Behind him, the rusted car collapsed in on itself with a deafening crash, sealing off the way he had come. He lay there for a moment, trembling, before forcing himself to his feet. The new car was different yet again. It was vast and open, with no seats or walls, just an endless expanse of darkness broken only by a single beam of light that shone down from above. In the center of the light stood a figure. It was the conductor. The man's breath caught in his throat. The conductor was tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. His uniform was pristine, but it seemed to shimmer unnaturally, as if it were made of something other than fabric. He held a lantern in one hand, its light casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. "You've come far," the conductor said, his voice low and resonant. "But this is where your journey ends." The man took a step back, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What is this place?" The conductor tilted his head, his face still hidden in shadow. "I am the keeper of this train," he said, "and you are one of its passengers. You cannot leave until your journey is complete." "What journey?" the man asked, his voice rising. "I didn't ask to be here. I just want to go home." The conductor's laughter echoed through the car, cold and mirthless. "Home? You have no home. Not anymore. This train is your home now, and it will be your home forever unless you can face the truth." The man's fists clenched. "What truth? Tell me." The conductor stepped closer, the light from his lantern casting eerie patterns on the floor. "The truth is that you are not ready to leave. You cling to the past, to the life you lost. Until you let go, you will remain here, trapped in this endless journey." The man's mind raced. He thought of the woman in the hospital room, the memory that had surfaced earlier. Was she the key? Was she the reason he couldn't move on? "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. The conductor raised a hand and the beam of light shifted, illuminating a door at the far end of the car. "Go through that door," he said. "Face what lies beyond. But be warned, not everyone who enters comes back." The man hesitated, his heart pounding. He didn't trust the conductor, but he knew he had no choice. If he wanted to escape, he had to face whatever was on the other side of that door. He took a deep breath and walked toward the door, the conductor's eyes burning into his back. As he reached for the handle, he felt a surge of fear, but he pushed it down. He turned the handle and stepped through. The door led to a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of himself. Some were younger, some older, but all of them carried the same expression of fear and regret. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence, until he reached the end of the corridor. There, he found a single mirror, larger than the others. Its surface was cloudy, but as he approached, it began to clear. He saw himself standing in the hospital room again, but this time he was not an observer. He was there, in the room, looking down at the woman who had been holding his hand. Her face was streaked with tears, but she looked up at him, her eyes filled with love and sorrow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The man felt a lump in his throat. He reached out to touch her, but his hand passed through her as if she were a ghost. He realized then that he was the ghost, the one who had been left behind. The memory shifted, and he saw himself standing on the dark, rainy road, the headlights of the other car bearing down on him. He felt the impact, the searing pain, and then nothing. He had died in that moment, but his soul had refused to let go. He had clung to the life he had lost, unable to accept that it was over. The mirror's surface rippled and the image faded. The man stood there, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the truth washed over him. He was dead. He had been dead all along. This train, this endless journey, was his purgatory, a place for souls who couldn't move on. But now he understood. He had to let go. He had to say goodbye. The man stood before the mirror, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a physical force. He was dead. The accident had taken his life, and this train was his prison, a place where lost souls wandered until they could confront their unfinished business. The woman in the hospital room, her face, her tears, her whispered apologies, was the anchor that bound him here. He had been unable to let go, unable to say goodbye. But now he knew what he had to do. The corridor began to dissolve around him, the mirrors shattering one by one, their fragments dissolving into light. He felt a pull, a force drawing him forward, and he allowed it to guide him. The train's oppressive atmosphere began to lift, replaced by a sense of calm, of finality. He walked through the fading corridor, his steps steady, his heart at peace. At the end of the corridor, he found himself standing on a platform. It was not the desolate station where he had first boarded the train, but a place bathed in soft, golden light. The air was warm, and the scent of flowers filled his senses. The platform stretched out into infinity, and at its edge stood the woman from his memories. She was exactly as he remembered her, her hair framing her face, her eyes filled with love and sorrow. She smiled as he approached, and he felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice soft and gentle. He reached out, and this time his hand didn't pass through her. He felt the warmth of her skin, the solidity of her presence. Tears welled up in his eyes as he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as if he could make up for all the time they had lost. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I left you." She shook her head, her own tears falling. "It's not your fault. You didn't want to go. But it's time now. You have to let go." He nodded, his heart breaking even as it filled with a sense of peace. He had spent so long clinging to the past, to the life he had lost, but now he understood. He couldn't stay here. He had to move on. "I love you," he said, his voice trembling. "I always will." "I love you too," she replied, her smile radiant even through her tears. "But you have to go. It's okay. I'll be okay." He held her for a moment longer, savoring the feel of her in his arms, the warmth of her presence. Then, reluctantly, he let her go. She stepped back, her hand lingering in his for a moment before she released him. The platform began to fade, the golden light growing brighter, more intense. He felt a sense of weightlessness, as if he were being lifted up, carried away. He looked back at her one last time, memorizing her face, her smile, the love in her eyes. "Goodbye," he whispered. "Goodbye," she replied, her voice barely audible over the growing hum of the light. And then she was gone. The platform dissolved, and he was surrounded by light, pure and blinding. He felt no fear, no pain, only a sense of peace and acceptance. He had faced his past, his regrets, and now he was free. The light began to fade, and he found himself standing in a vast, open space. It was neither dark nor light, but a place of perfect balance. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see the conductor, his face no longer hidden in shadow. His features were kind, his eyes filled with understanding. "You've done well," the conductor said. "You've faced your truth, and now you are free to move on." The man nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for helping me find my way." The conductor smiled. "This train is not a punishment," he said. "It is a journey, a chance to confront what holds us back. You have completed your journey. Now it is time to rest." The man felt a final surge of warmth, a sense of completion. He closed his eyes, letting the light carry him away. The train, the endless tunnels, the lost souls, they all faded into the distance, replaced by a sense of infinite peace. And then, there was nothing.